Nathaniel Cross was one of the richest men in America, a man who had built an empire from nothing and answered to no one. Grace Bennett had $9 folded into the pocket of a jacket that was 2 sizes too big for her, and she had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. On a cold October morning on a crowded street in Manhattan, their two worlds collided in a way that neither of them would ever forget. She ran. And when she ran, Nathaniel Cross did something that no one who knew him would have ever expected. He did not call his security detail. He did not reach for his phone. He ran after her himself, weaving through strangers, his $3,000 coat flying open behind him, chasing a girl he had never met over a wallet that held far more than money inside it. For 1 single second, his hand closed around the sleeve of her jacket, and she turned to look back at him, her eyes locking onto his in a moment that would end his marriage, collapse a business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and unravel everything Nathaniel Cross believed about his own life. What she said to him in the next few seconds was so unexpected, so devastating, that a man who had negotiated with world leaders and closed deals that reshaped entire industries found himself standing frozen in the middle of a New York sidewalk, unable to speak. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why the most dangerous thing you can do to a powerful man is not to steal from him, it is to tell him the truth he has spent his entire life running from. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened on that sidewalk, you have to understand who Nathaniel Cross really was. Not the man the magazines wrote about, but the man underneath the tailored suits and the private jets. Nathaniel had not been born into money. He grew up in a modest house in Ohio, the son of a school teacher and a machinist, and he learned early that nothing in life would be handed to him. By the time he was 30, he had built a technology company from a single idea, a small office, and a partner who believed in him before anyone else did. That partner's name was Walter Bennett, a quiet, brilliant engineer who designed the very system that would eventually make Nathaniel Cross a household name. Walter never wanted fame. He wanted to build something that mattered. Nathaniel wanted both. And in the end, only one of them got what he wanted. The two men had started the company together, splitting everything equally, shaking hands on a promise that neither of them ever wrote down because they trusted each other completely. That trust became Walter's undoing. When outside investors came calling with more money than either man had ever imagined, Nathaniel drafted new paperwork. Paperwork, he told Walter, was simply a formality to satisfy the lawyers. Walter, exhausted from months of 18-hour days in the lab, signed without reading every line. Buried in that paperwork was a clause that diluted Walter's ownership from half the company to less than 2%. By the time Walter understood what had happened, the deal was closed, the money was moving, and Nathaniel Cross was already being called a visionary in the press. Walter Bennett tried to fight it. He hired a lawyer he could barely afford, but Nathaniel's team of attorneys buried him in delays and paperwork until Walter's savings ran out and he had no choice but to walk away. He never spoke publicly about what happened, not because he had made peace with it, but because he was too proud to beg for what should have already been his. He took a job as a mechanic, then a night shift at a warehouse, watching from a distance as the company he built exploded into a global brand worth billions of dollars. He told his wife and eventually his daughter that some men will smile at you while they take everything you have, and you will not even feel it happening until it is far too late to stop them. That daughter was Grace Bennett, and she grew up hearing her father's story in fragments, late at night when he thought she was asleep. She grew up watching her mother count coins at the kitchen table to pay for groceries while, across the country, Nathaniel Cross was buying his second private jet. Walter Bennett died when Grace was 19, his heart giving out after years of stress and quiet bitterness that he never fully let go of. On his last night in the hospital, he held Grace's hand and told her that he did not regret building something beautiful, only that he had trusted the wrong man to help him build it. Grace never forgot those words. She carried them with her the way other people carry grief, folded up small enough to survive, but never small enough to disappear. For a while, Grace tried to build a normal life. She worked retail during the day and studied at night, determined to become something her father would have been proud of. She had a small apartment, a steady job at a department store, and a plan for her future that did not involve looking backward. Then, in the span of 8 months, everything fell apart. The store she worked for closed its doors without warning, part of a wave of corporate restructuring that eliminated hundreds of jobs overnight. Her mother, who had never fully recovered from years of financial stress, passed away shortly after, leaving behind medical bills that swallowed what little savings the family had left. Grace lost her apartment 2 months later. By the time autumn arrived, she was sleeping in shelters and on the floors of friends who could no longer afford to keep helping her. Grace had seen Nathaniel Cross's face 100 times over the years, on magazine covers, in doctor's office waiting rooms, on television screens, in store windows, on billboards advertising his company's latest achievement. She had always looked away, the way you look away from something that hurts too much to face directly. But on that particular October morning, walking past a hotel entrance in Midtown Manhattan, with nowhere else to be, she saw him in person for the first time in her life, stepping out of a black car surrounded by assistants, laughing at something on his phone. For a moment, Grace simply stood there, frozen, staring at the man her father had spent his final years trying not to hate. Something inside her shifted in that instant. Something that had been building quietly for years without her fully realizing it. She was not thinking clearly. She was hungry, exhausted, grieving, and standing 10 feet away from the man she believed had destroyed her family. She did not plan what happened next. As Nathaniel walked past her, distracted by his phone, Grace reached out and slipped his wallet from the inside pocket of his coat, a motion so quick and practiced that even she was surprised by how easily it happened. She was not trying to steal money. She barely thought about the cash inside. She wanted to see his driver's license up close. She wanted to hold something that belonged to him, just once, the way he had held everything that once belonged to her family. Nathaniel felt it almost immediately, a small shift of weight against his chest that most people would never have noticed. He turned, saw a young woman in an oversized jacket walking briskly away from him, and understood instantly what had happened. In 20 years of building an empire, Nathaniel Cross had developed instincts that most billionaires never needed, instincts sharpened by years of people trying to take advantage of him in boardrooms and back channels. But this felt different. He did not call out for his security team, who were only a few steps behind him. Instead, something he could not explain made him move first, breaking into a run before he had even decided to chase her, chasing a stranger through a crowded Manhattan street over a leather wallet that held nothing more valuable than cash, credit cards, and one old photograph he had carried for over 20 years. The chase lasted less than 90 seconds, though to both of them it felt far longer. Grace was fast, cutting through pedestrians with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to move quickly through crowded places. But Nathaniel was determined in a way that surprised even himself. He caught up to her near the corner of the block, his hand closing around the sleeve of her jacket just as she turned, breathless, to face him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Nathaniel expected fear in her eyes, or perhaps defiance, the kind of hardened expression he associated with people who made a habit of stealing from strangers. Instead, he saw something that stopped him completely. He saw recognition. She was not looking at him like a stranger. She was looking at him like someone she had been waiting years to meet. Nathaniel held out his hand, expecting her to return the wallet and disappear into the crowd, the way most encounters like this ended. Grace did not move. Instead, she asked him a single question, her voice steady despite everything her body had just been through. She asked if the name Walter Bennett meant anything to him. For a moment, Nathaniel simply stared at her, his mind refusing to connect the dots quickly enough to keep up with what was happening. Then, the color drained slowly from his face. 20 years of carefully constructed success, decades of interviews where he described himself as a self-made visionary, all of it seemed to collapse in the space between one breath and the next. He had not heard that name spoken out loud in over a decade, and hearing it now, from a stranger who had just stolen his wallet on a crowded New York sidewalk, hit him harder than any hostile takeover ever had. Grace watched his reaction carefully, and in that moment, she understood something she had never fully believed until now. He remembered. Whatever story Nathaniel Cross had told himself over the years to justify what happened to her father, some part of him had never truly forgotten. She told him her name, watching him flinch as though she had physically struck him. She told him that Walter Bennett had been her father, that he had died believing the company he helped build would never remember his name, and that she had grown up watching her mother struggle to survive on almost nothing while Nathaniel's face appeared on magazine covers celebrating his genius. She was not shouting. She did not need to. Her voice remained calm and controlled, which somehow made every word land harder than if she had screamed them at him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Cross had absolutely nothing to say. His assistants had caught up by now, standing a few feet away, unsure whether to intervene or wait for instructions that were not coming. A small crowd had begun to gather, phones raised, recording a scene that none of them fully understood but instinctively knew was significant. Nathaniel barely noticed any of it. He was staring at Grace, seeing in her face traces of a man he had spent 2 decades trying not to think about. A man whose trust he had exploited in the earliest, most desperate days of building his company. He asked her, quietly, what she wanted from him. Grace opened the wallet, pulled out the old photograph tucked behind his identification, and held it up so he could see it clearly. It was a photograph of 2 young men standing in front of a small, rented office space, arms around each other's shoulders, both of them grinning with the kind of unguarded joy that comes only once before success changes everything about a person. Nathaniel had carried that photograph in his wallet for over 20 years, a private reminder he rarely allowed himself to look at directly. Grace told him she had heard about the photograph from her mother, who had seen it once during a meeting Walter had insisted on having with Nathaniel years earlier, a meeting that ended with Walter walking out and never speaking to Nathaniel again. Grace said she had wanted to see it for herself, to know whether some small part of the man in that photograph still existed inside the man standing in front of her now, or whether he had disappeared completely the moment the money started arriving. News of the confrontation spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Someone in the gathering crowd had recorded the entire exchange, and by that evening, clips of the encounter were circulating across social media. Though without the full context that only Grace and Nathaniel truly understood. Financial journalists who had spent years profiling Nathaniel Cross as a self-made success story began asking questions publicly for the first time about the mysterious disappearance of his original business partner. Old interviews resurfaced in which Nathaniel had vaguely referenced an early partner who, in his words, decided the business was not the right fit for him. Reporters who had never thought to dig deeper into that story suddenly had a reason to. Within 48 hours, the name Walter Bennett was trending online, attached to a story much larger than a single stolen wallet. Nathaniel's fiancée, a well-known figure in New York social circles herself, learned about the incident the same way most of the public did, through a video clip sent to her by a friend before Nathaniel had a chance to explain anything in person. She confronted him that evening, and for the first time in their relationship, Nathaniel found himself unable to offer the smooth, controlled answers that had gotten him through countless difficult conversations in the past. He tried to explain the paperwork, the early days of the company, the impossible pressure of trying to satisfy investors who threatened to walk away entirely if ownership structures were not simplified. She listened, and when he finished, she asked him a single question that he had never allowed himself to ask directly. She asked whether he believed Walter Bennett had understood what he was signing. Nathaniel did not answer immediately, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. Their engagement, which had once seemed destined for a wedding covered by every major society publication in the country, quietly unraveled over the following weeks. She was not the only one who distanced herself. A major business deal Nathaniel had been finalizing, a partnership worth several $100 million with an international investment group, collapsed almost overnight as the company's leadership grew nervous about the negative publicity surrounding their potential partner. Board members who had spent years publicly praising Nathaniel's leadership began quietly questioning whether his personal controversies would damage the company's reputation. For the first time since he was a young man struggling to get his first idea off the ground, Nathaniel Cross understood what it felt like to have people doubt him. Meanwhile, journalists investigating the story uncovered documents that painted an even more complicated picture than Grace herself had known. Internal company records from the earliest years showed that Nathaniel had been advised by legal counsel at the time that the restructuring of ownership was ethically questionable, even if it was technically legal. There were emails, later obtained through public records requests tied to an unrelated lawsuit years earlier, in which Nathaniel had privately acknowledged that Walter deserved more credit and compensation than he ultimately received. Promises Nathaniel had made to himself that he would make things right once the company stabilized, promises that were quietly forgotten as the company grew larger and Nathaniel grew more comfortable with the life his success had built for him. Reading those old emails again, printed out in a folder his lawyers had prepared for damage control, Nathaniel felt something he had successfully avoided feeling for over 20 years: genuine shame. For several weeks after the encounter, Grace disappeared from public view entirely, refusing interview requests from journalists eager to turn her into either a hero or a cautionary tale, depending on their publication's angle. She was not interested in becoming a headline. She had said what she needed to say to Nathaniel Cross, and beyond that, she wanted nothing to do with the media circus unfolding around her father's name. She continued sleeping in shelters, continued searching for stable work, largely unaware of how thoroughly her brief encounter with Nathaniel had begun reshaping his life from the inside out. It was during this period of silence that Nathaniel made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him, including, in many ways, himself. He asked his assistant to find her. It took nearly 2 weeks for Nathaniel's team to locate Grace, working through shelters and social service organizations across the city with a discretion that Nathaniel insisted on personally. When they finally found her, he did not send a lawyer or a representative to speak on his behalf. He went himself, arriving unannounced at a community center where Grace had recently started volunteering in exchange for a place to stay. She was visibly startled to see him standing there, dressed down in a way she had never seen in any photograph, without the usual entourage of assistants and security. He asked if they could talk, not as a billionaire addressing a grievance, but as one person finally ready to have an honest conversation with another. Grace, cautious but no longer afraid, agreed. What followed was not a dramatic reconciliation, not the kind of tidy redemption story audiences often expect from moments like this. Nathaniel did not simply write Grace a check and consider the debt settled, and to her credit, Grace would not have accepted one if he had. Instead, over the following months, Nathaniel worked quietly, largely outside the attention of the media, to establish a foundation in Walter Bennett's name, one dedicated to supporting the families of overlooked engineers and inventors whose contributions had been erased from the companies they helped build. He offered Grace a position within the foundation itself, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a genuine leadership role where her voice and her father's legacy would carry real weight in decisions about who the foundation helped and how. Grace accepted, on the condition that the role be earned through her own work, not granted out of guilt. The public reaction to these developments was mixed, as these stories often are. Some praised Nathaniel for finally attempting to make things right, however many years too late that attempt had come. Others pointed out, correctly, that no foundation and no job offer could undo 2 decades of hardship that Walter Bennett's family had endured, while Nathaniel Cross enjoyed unprecedented wealth and public admiration. Grace herself never claimed that what happened made everything right again. In one of the only interviews she eventually agreed to give, she said that her father had died, believing his work would be forgotten, and that nothing Nathaniel did now could give her father back the years he lost fighting to be recognized for what he built. What mattered to her, she said, was simply that his name would finally mean something to people who never had the chance to know him. Nathaniel Cross never fully recovered his old public image, and in many ways, he stopped trying to. The business deal that collapsed in the aftermath of the confrontation was eventually replaced by other opportunities, though Nathaniel approached them differently than before, more cautious, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the people whose contributions built his success. His engagement never resumed, and he rarely spoke publicly about what happened, though those who worked closely with him noticed a quiet, persistent change in how he treated the people around him, particularly those who had less power than he did. He kept the old photograph, the one Grace had held up to him on that sidewalk, in a frame on his desk instead of hidden in his wallet, a visible reminder rather than a private one. Grace Bennett rebuilt her life slowly, deliberately, refusing to let the sudden attention surrounding her story define who she was or who she wanted to become. She eventually returned to school, completing the education she had been forced to abandon, all while continuing her work with the foundation that carried her father's name. She has said, on the rare occasions she discusses it publicly, that she does not consider what happened between her and Nathaniel Cross a happy ending, because happy endings suggest that everything lost can eventually be found again. What she found instead was something closer to closure, an acknowledgement, finally given, that her father's work and her family's suffering had mattered, even if that acknowledgement came decades later than it should have. There is a lesson buried inside this story that reaches far beyond the lives of two people in New York City. Money can build empires, fund foundations, and rewrite public narratives, but it cannot undo the quiet damage caused by walking past the people who helped you succeed once they were no longer useful to you. Nathaniel Cross spent 20 years believing that success alone was proof that he had earned everything he had. It took a stranger with $9 in her pocket, a stolen wallet, and a truth she had carried her entire life to show him otherwise. Whether that truth changed him permanently, or simply for as long as the public was watching, is a question even those closest to him still debate. So we leave you with the same question this story leaves behind. If someone you had wronged years ago suddenly stood in front of you, forcing you to face what you had done, would you run from that truth, or would you finally stop and listen? Would you have chased her, the way Nathaniel did? Or would you have simply called security and let her disappear into the crowd, the way so many people in his position might have? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this story affected you the way it affected us, stay close.
Subscribe.
Because our next story is even harder to forget. The story of a security guard who turned down $2 million
Comment
to
where
keep
you
a
are
single
watching
promise
from.
he made to a dying man. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and we will see you in the next one.